Thank you. That one. Cool. So thanks very much for inviting me. So I guess I'm hopefully unusual, or not hopefully unusual, but probably relatively unusual in that at the moment 3 days a week I'm working as a philosopher at UCL, but the other 2 days a week I'm doing quite a lot of work with NHS Digital, particularly advising as a member of the independent group advising on the release of data on the use of identifiable data in the NHS, and also doing a little bit of work with the National Data Guardian. So that this paper is very much a kind of reflection as a philosopher on some of the sorts of decisions I'm called upon to make as part of a committee. In fact, one or two of the people from that committee are in fact here today, so they may be going to ask me some tricky questions or tell me why I've got the law or other parts of it wrong. So the question we're really focused on today is about what we can describe as secondary uses or new uses of data. So that a lot of the time it will happen that data is collected for one particular reason, often entirely legitimately. It might be that you've collected data as a result of GPs' consultations or as a result of a research project. Sometimes this is data that's been collected via implied consent, as it often is when you visit your GP, or it might be data which is collected as a result of explicit consent. But that there'll be lots of cases where it turns out later on that there are lots of other things that you could do with the data which you hadn't anticipated doing before. And there'll be cases of this sort where it'll turn out that whatever it was that people consented to when they initially consented to give over their data, it's not covered by what you now want to do with the data, with the data. And so this is actually really an enormous problem within the NHS at the moment, so that there's, well, at the very least about 200 massive cases of this, which the committee I sit on deal with. And often it's studies which have invested tens of millions of pounds, perhaps over 20 or 30 years, and where they're faced with the problem of, well, can we still rely on the consent that was taken many years ago? What happens if we want to do new things with people's data? Do we need to go out and get consent again from like 100,000 people or 1 million people? If they did that, that would be massively expensive, difficult to track down all the people. So there's a lot of pressure within the system to come up with a way of using data that's already been collected, which has been consented, but for purposes which people didn't initially consent to. And that from a philosopher's perspective, somebody who, like me, who's an ethicist rather than a lawyer, I think there's something interesting and quite problematic about this, because if you believe in the idea of informed consent, then you believe that people consent to quite specific things usually. If somebody's consented to one thing and then you want to do something else with their data, then at the very least, there's a risk that you might be violating their rights, that you might be infringing their autonomy, failing to respect their privacy in some important way. But nonetheless, obviously, there's potentially great benefits that could be derived from use of data in ways that people hadn't anticipated. So, just to give you a sort of sense of how complicated the issue are and sort of some of the different parts of it before we actually get to the main meal, I wanted to just set out some of the sort of complexities that a committee like the one I sit on has to deal with. So that, first thing to say is that, well, often when consent was given and taken 20 years or so ago, then the standards of what was deemed to be enough information were completely different. So that sometimes we were faced with a case where somebody in good faith did their best, they took the best advice that was available, they provided what seemed to be reasonable information at the time to the 10,000 or more people who agreed to take part in a study. But now looking at it now, we think, well, that looks a bit inadequate. You haven't said very much at all about what the information is going to be used for, who will access it, and all these other things. Those sorts of things were deemed not to really matter 20 years ago. But now, progressively, you've seen a rise in requirements of specificity in the kind of information that you give to patients taking part in a research study. And so obviously now that the information provided may run to pages, whereas it was often just like a single sentence back in 1995. So one question we often wrestle with is a question about the meaning of consent. When consent has been given 15 or 20 years ago, and it would have been deemed to be reasonable consent at the time, but now standards have shifted. Are we still allowed to rely on that consent? Do we have to go back and ask people to effectively tell these researchers, well, we know you've got 10,000 people or 100,000 people in your study, but you need to go back and get consent from all of those? I mean, for obvious reasons, the researchers themselves are extremely reluctant to do that. They say it was expensive. We've lost track of the cohort of people. It's just impracticable to do that. And there's another issue as well, which is sort of, I think, conceptually separate, but it's interrelated. The question, well, have the people who initially gave their consent back 10 years, 15 years ago, have they changed their mind in the meantime? And if so, have you given them adequate opportunity to opt out? So that if it's a matter of, say, a research study where 10 or 15 years ago you asked people, are you happy for your data to be used for this, and we may keep it, but then you haven't told them, well, we intend to keep that in perpetuity, then have you violated people's expectations by continuing to keep the data for so long, or continue to link that data? So that one of the principles that the National Data Guardian is particularly keen to push on, she often uses the phrase no surprises, the idea being that there's an implicit understanding that was between the researcher and the person who signed up to it along those times, and you can alter that to a certain extent by information you provide along the way, but you should never create a scenario in which people feel that their expectations have been violated. Another aspect that we need to take account of is what we can call the scope of consent, so that if somebody signs a piece of paper saying they consent to something, then what they consent to is a specific proposition. They're consenting to something, either to do that something be done to them, or to allow something to occur. Now, often there'll be sort of things that are a bit sort of vague around the boundaries of what it is that they've consented to, but at the same time there'll also be many things that are deliberately ruled out by the consent that was given. And again, the kind of problems we face is that 10, 15 years ago, people hadn't really thought about the need to use data over a long period of time, or potentially for slightly different purposes from the ones they initially had in mind. And so that we often find statements which will obviously, from the researcher's perspective, thought, well, this will make it even more ethically robust. This will show that we won't be misusing people's data. And they say things which are then completely tie them in knots. So in fact, on the committee we were looking at only this week, there was a statement within one of the things that they said to the people taking part in their study, saying, well, there are no circumstances short of a court order where we would discuss any of the information we hold about you with any third party. Apart from it then turns out 10, 15 years later, that's exactly what they want to do. And they face then an enormous problem. So within sort of the idea of the core of informed consent as an ethical principle, it looks like we need to distinguish between some things that are explicitly ruled out by the information that you've given to somebody. So if in the information you give to someone that you say to them, under no circumstances will you use your information for this, it's very difficult at a later point to go back and say, well, we now want to use the information for that purpose, unless you can get a fresh consent from somebody. But there'll be other cases where it's possibly a grayer area, where something is not explicitly ruled out by what's initially been said, but you can do a certain amount, possibly with providing extra information to people to clarify what it was that you think that they signed up to in the first place. But despite all we can do in order to try to clarify the consent that's already given, or try to encourage researchers to think through about the possible future uses of data so that they don't tie themselves in knots in these ways, we're faced with these large number of cases that we do have on the books where we're pretty sure that there's something useful that a researcher might want to do, and it's not covered by consent that was initially given. And there's basically three options at this moment. Either you can go and get fresh consent from each individual who initially gave their consent. Second option is you can find some way of anonymizing the information in such a way so that you can still do the project that you want to do, but that somehow, because the information has become anonymized, you're no longer wronging anyone if you use the information without their consent. And the third one is what we'll be focusing most on today, is find a way of proceeding without seeking fresh consent, without anonymizing, but hopefully without wronging the people whose data that we're using. That's a really hard problem to crack, and that's what we'll be talking about most of the time. So, first thing to say is, if it's simple and practicable to get consent from people, then there are very good reasons for thinking this is exactly what we should do. So if it's a study where you know who the people are whose data you want to use, there's a small number of them, it's easy for you to write to them, telephone them, either to get them to consent or refuse to consent. But that looks absolutely the best option, because if you start from the assumption that people have a right to control their personal information about them, then those people definitely have the ability to waive that right if they want to. If they waive that right on the basis of the right kind of information, then there's no way in which you've wronged them. What you want to do is bulletproof. But the unfortunate fact is that there'll be lots and lots of cases where it just turns out to be either sort of unfeasibly costly and impractical to contact people and reconsent them. So that there'll be lots of cases where the number of people is extraordinarily large. So that there's a study being run out of Oxford at the moment called the Million Women Study, which literally started with 1 million women. If you've got to write to 1 million people, get consent information to 1 million people, get those forms back. It's an enormous undertaking, let alone the fact that many of those people will have moved. You'll have lost contact with them. So, in other cases, there may be some edge cases where you think that consent's not an option for other sorts of reasons. It may be that particular kind of sorts of research, that the research can only be done if you don't tell people what you're doing. Maybe certain sorts of observational research, or certain sort of research done in the public interest where it's necessary to expose wrongdoing. There may be cases where it might be important for certain sorts of reasons to use information about people without their consent. Otherwise it will ruin the consent. So those are very kind of rare and edge cases. But the most common sort of case that we're talking about is just where the number of people involved who initially gave their consent is so large that it just seems unfeasible and impractical to actually go back to each and every one of them to ask their permission. So consent is going to work sometimes, but not always. Another alternative is going to be to go for anonymization. So again, it looks like where it's feasible for a research project or a piece of healthcare commissioning to be done with anonymized data, there's strong reasons for doing that. So that if you data protection principle in the Data Protection Act requires that the use of personal data be minimized. And certainly, if you can answer the question that you want to answer, if you can do everything you want to do without knowing anything about the identities of individuals, there's a strong question of why is it that you require to know the identities of individuals? Why not do it with anonymized data? And so if you can do your project with anonymized data, you should do. But again, there are going to be a number of cases where it turns out anonymization is not a feasible option. So that often the kind of cases we see in our committee is cases where you need to link two data sets together, and the only way you can link those two data sets together is by a common identifier. For example, the NHS number, or sometimes kind of name and date of birth, things of that sort. So if you need to link two data sets together using identifiers, there's no way of doing that with anonymized data. Or perhaps there might be reasons why the researchers themselves need to be able to contact individuals. And so in all those kinds of cases, it's just going to be, by its nature, completely impossible to do the research that you need to do, or to do the commissioning or whatever it is that you need to do with properly anonymized data. So this basically leaves us with a set of a core of cases which are just going to be really problematic. So there are cases where we know that whatever the existing consent has been given, it just doesn't cover this new use of the data. There are cases also where we just think it's not feasible to go and get a fresh consent from all the people who initially consented. And lastly, where the research can't be undertaken without using identifiable data. If you put all those things together, then we're faced with this problem, well, how do we use people's identifiable information without their consent, but in a way that doesn't wrong them? So the big question is, well, how interesting is this as a problem? I think it's really interesting, it's really deep as a problem, just largely because there's so many studies going on in the UK and elsewhere which require us to have some kind of resolution to this, this problem. And so there's a few sort of other pieces just to point out in order to say, well, in order for the problem to be a problem that's deep and interesting and worth thinking about, philosophically as ethicists. So I'm just going to, I'm assuming here for the purposes of argument, I do have arguments for it elsewhere, but I'm assuming that, well, there is a strong ethical duty as well as a legal duty to gain informed consent before using people's data, if it's practicable to do so. I think that you would quite obviously wrong somebody if it was a case where you could have asked their consent to use their identifiable information and you just don't bother. So in the usual case, I think it's really important to get consent. That's part of the jigsaw. You may be somebody who's very kind of blasé about privacy. You might think, well, privacy, nobody cares about privacy anymore. We're all on Facebook and so on. You may have that kind of view, in which case you probably wouldn't see this problem by setting up as a particularly interesting problem. But I would, if we had longer to talk, I'd try to make the case to you that, well, privacy is important enough that we should take consent seriously in this kind of case. And the other thing that we need to presuppose in order for the problem to be an interesting one, not just philosophically but practically, is there has to be something really significant at stake. So if it turned out, well, we just couldn't do this project that we wanted to do and it didn't really matter very much, and again, it wouldn't be a very interesting problem. But it's precisely because the sorts of research that people want to do is maybe a continuation of something like the Million Women study, where you have a cohort of 1 million women. There's really important things that you could find out, say, about osteoporosis or aging, which just weren't included in what people initially signed up to. But nonetheless, you feel that this would be really important for the NHS. It'd be important for healthcare more generally to find out. It's at that point that things really bite, where you realise that we could do significant amounts of good in the world. We could save lives, or at least improve people's quality of life on really quite a large scale. But in order to do that, we need to use people's data in a way that goes beyond what they initially consented to. So that's the problem. So here's a kind of example. This is a kind of schematic version of something we see. I reckon maybe once a month or so we get one of these on the independent group advising on the release of data. So imagine that consent was initially obtained 10 or 15 years ago for a large cohort study. And the consent information that was given to patients explicitly ruled out linking the data that was generated by the study with participants' broader routine health medical records, or sharing identifiable information with third parties. And now, as things have progressed and there's more availability of data and so on, in a new phase of the study, it becomes apparent that either, that the original study design can't really be completed without linking to additional patient records, or that perhaps a useful new purpose, such as insight into a different kind of disease, could be obtained by linking to these records. And we're rare because it's a large study, and also we don't really know where a lot of the people who consented initially are now. It would be massively time-consuming and costly to reconsent every single person who's in the initial study. And also, we're aware that the kind of data linkage we need to do in order to get these benefits for patients down the line will require the use of identifiable patient information. That's the nub of the problem. I mean, you can change the details, little bits in, little bits out, but we basically face pretty much this problem about once a month on the committee I sit on, or many of us here sit on, some of us here sit on. So there's a legal mechanism which is helpful, which tries to solve the problem in legal terms of what to do in these kinds of cases. So there's Section 251 of the NHS Act 2001. It provides a mechanism for the use of identifiable health information to proceed in the public interest without consent. So there's a group called the Confidentiality Advisory Group whose job it is to advise on these sorts of matters. So basically, I don't know whether any researchers are in the house here who actually applied to the Confidentiality Advisory Group, but the way it will work is that you have to fill in your application form, apply to the Confidentiality Advisory Group, ask that what would usually be the common law duty of confidentiality be waived. They can then make a recommendation to the Secretary of State for Health, and then officially it's signed off by Jeremy Hunt. So the purpose, they say, is to enable the common law duty of confidentiality to be overridden, or to enable disclosure of confidential patient information for medical purposes, where it's not possible to use anonymised information, and where seeking consent is not practical, having regard to the cost and the technology available. So there's a legal mechanism to do this in the UK, and you'll find in England rather than the UK, to be more precise. And you'll find in some other countries there's a similar sort of legal mechanism. So that I've become quite interested for the last couple of years as well. I can see that there might be in some ways, a good practical reason for having a legal gateway of this sort. But what's the ethical argument for it? I think that there's at least prima facie reasons for thinking there's something really quite ethically dubious about allowing this sort of thing to occur. So long as, at least if you think that privacy is important, then it seems quite difficult to justify effectively sort of what looks like violating people's rights to privacy just because you think it will be expedient to do so. So the nub of the issue is about the idea of impracticability. So that so this Section 251, it's often used to argue that it would be impracticable to gain consent from all of a large population, even though if we were doing a very similar research project, which with a much smaller population, we would have to go and reconsent everyone. So that think of it this way. If you have a massive cohort study with 100,000 people in it, then you can apply to get your Section 251 approval saying, well, it would just be impracticable for us to have to go and get consent from all those 100,000 people. Whereas if you had a smaller research study which only had 100 people in it, then you definitely have to go and you'd write to all those 100 people and you have to get consent from them one by one. Whereas I'm never quite sure why that should be, because if the purpose of the right to privacy is to protect individuals, and if those rights are rights of individuals, then it's never really very clear to me why we should think that someone's, the protections connected to someone's right should get diluted the bigger the group that they're in. So yeah, I mean, the potential challenge is, well, if it would violate someone's rights if they're a member of a group of 100 not to ask them individually for their permission, then why is it okay as if they become a member of a group of 1,000 or 10,000? And that doesn't look like a very easy question to answer in ethical terms. So one thing we need to do before going any further is make a distinction between what we do in ethics and what we do in law. So that we're used in legal terms to talk about rights, so that in America people talk about the right to bear arms, for example. And that unless you're kind of really sort of fanatical about that, you probably think by the idea of a right to bear arms, you think that because it's in the Constitution, it exists as a law, and because it exists as a law in that way, then there's a permission to do that. But the philosophers also talk about rights in a slightly different way. They talk about, for example, about natural rights or about moral rights. And the thought there is that, well, in addition to legal rights, there's certain things that it's just wrong to do to people. So that many philosophers, and I think probably the vast majority of people in the room would take it that something like, say, torture is wrong, or murder is wrong, or rape is wrong. It violates people's rights. But it's not wrong just because it's against the law. So that if you were to pass a law saying, well, it's now okay to murder, or it's now okay to rape people, it wouldn't stop being wrong to perform those sorts of actions. And so philosophers often want to talk about moral rights as a kind of right which is much more fundamental than legal rights. So from the philosopher's perspective, you ask the question, well, what sorts of things should we protect about in human beings as individuals? What sorts of things is it wrong to do to human beings as individuals? And then they want to use that as a basis for thinking about the sorts of things that should be legal or illegal. And from a philosopher's perspective, you might very much want to say that, well, if a legal system doesn't protect all the moral rights that there are, then there's something defective about that as a legal system. And so where we're going with this is a question for all of us. Well, is privacy a moral right, or is it merely a legal right? So again, this is part of the setup of our problem. So that if it turns out that privacy is only a legal right, but not a moral right, then something like Section 251 and this ability to use people's information without their consent, again, it doesn't look that problematic. If all there was just the fact that there are certain sorts of things which are on statute about how patients' information needs to be handled in the NHS, and then you say, well, we'll create another bit of law which allows us to circumvent those in other sorts of circumstances. If that was all that was happening, then there would be absolutely no problem at all. But I take it there is something deeper going on here. So if you scroll back a few years, how I sort of became initially interested in a lot of these topics was through sitting on another committee which is called the General Practice Extraction Service Independent Advisory Group, and one of the roles of that particular group was to advise on a scheme which was known as care.data. And this was, on the face of it, an attractive sounding idea. That the idea would be that, well, that all the data that was generated within individual GP systems would be sort of taken into the central NHS and then it'd be able to be used for research, for commissioning, maybe even for commercial purposes. The idea, well, we have this immense amount of data in the NHS, we're not using it as fully as we can. But it turned out there was such a backlash about that, about the way that the system was designed, because it was initially designed in a way that wasn't going to allow people to opt out from it. And despite what was proposed to be done, as it were, you could have made it legal by passing Act of Parliament to do it. But nonetheless, people just felt that what was being envisaged as we're using their information, identifiable or potentially identifiable information without their permission, violated their rights or wronged them in some kind of deep way. And so that there's a number of sort of privacy advocate organisations, people like sort of Med Confidential, who've made a lot of mileage out of, as it were, talking about the ethical wrongness or the legal dubiousness of proposals like care.data. And behind all this, there's a question really about, well, what is privacy? Why do we care about it? Is privacy just a matter of convention or the law, or is there some kind of serious moral right here? This is difficult terrain here, and I just want to say one or two things to make it at least plausible to think that there's a genuine moral right here. So it seems that one of the things that we take to be important about living in a free society is the ability to develop in your own way, to express thoughts, to try them out, to change who you are, and that becomes more and more difficult if you feel or reasonably feel that you're being under surveillance the whole time and whatever you do will be tracked and so on. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why people had such a significant degree of unease about the sort of revelations that came out through the documents leaked by Snowden and others, and the other sort of revelations of the last couple of weeks. It seems to threaten a certain set of assumptions that people have about their own ability to have a private sphere, to do things in which they're not accountable to other people, or so that if they want to sort of sing naked in their flat, they should be able to. Then they feel that if everything they do is somehow on public display or potentially on public display, it leads to a problematic kind of chilling effect where they're unable to try things out, or everything becomes staid and stifled. So there's at least an argument to be had there. Effectively saying, well, in order to be the kind of people we want to be, we need quite robust protections of privacy, and it looks like privacy and confidentiality are really important for protecting the doctor-patient relation. And so I think there's a good reasons for thinking that it may be not just a matter of legal rights here, but also moral rights here when we come to privacy, and particularly privacy in people's health information, or other sorts of things which go to the heart of the sorts of secrets they want to protect about themselves, which allow them to be the kind of people that they want to be, or to present the kind of front to the world that they want to present. So if we take it for granted that, that there is a genuine right to privacy here that needs to be protected, then we need to say one other thing about the nature of rights, which is pretty much common ground amongst philosophers. So that most philosophers take it for granted that, well, part of the role of what a right is rights protect really important interests, and it's very difficult to justifiably infringe or override people's rights. So that philosopher Ronald Dworkin once described rights as being like trumps, so that if you play a card game and you have a trump, then that automatically beats other cards. So even if clubs are trumps and you have the two of clubs, then that beats an ace of another suit, just because he thought that's what the logic of rights is. That's what they're for. The purpose of rights is almost to set themselves as against kind of mere social calculation of what's in the general benefit, so that to believe in rights is to basically say that there are certain things that need to be protected about people, even if protecting those things about people might be worse in some kind of abstract sense for the general good. That's maybe why it is that people take something like kind of human rights to be so important. You might think, well, the right to free speech is so important that even if it might have bad effects if somebody exercises that right, nonetheless we should protect it because of something important about protecting that particular freedom for individuals. So if we think of privacy in that way as a right in that way, then it leads to I think, a number of quite sort of difficult challenges about how to justify the sorts of things that the Confidentiality Advisory Group does when it says, well, OK, we can use this information without people's consent in the public interest. Because it looks like the sort of thing that should violate people's rights. So here's the argument for that. So if you take moral rights seriously as an idea, then you can't it's not easy to justify infringing or violating someone's rights. So if you infringe someone's right, you need to be able to provide a justification to that individual about why it is that you're doing something that would infringe their right. It's not a legitimate thing to say, well, I know that you had a right to property, say, but I took £1,000 from your bank account and I gave it to Oxfam. Even if you've created significantly more benefit by doing that, we don't think that's a legitimate justification for violating someone's rights in the usual case. And the tricky point here is that, well, if our cohort is big enough that it's going to be unfeasible to seek consent from each and every person, then it's also going to be the case that the cohort's large enough that it doesn't really matter whether you have one additional individual or not. So if we have our cohort of 100,000 people, really the difference in research power or what we can do with the data, the data of 100,000 people versus the data of 999,999 people is negligible. You couldn't measure it. And so so it seems very difficult to be able to give a justification to each individual as an individual to say, well, we really need to use your data without consent because otherwise the study would fall apart. That just doesn't fly as an argument, because if you didn't use that particular individual's data, then there would still be the data of lots and lots of other people. So it doesn't seem like the right kind of justification that could be used for infringing someone's right. So it seems very difficult to make the case that, well, look at all this benefit. Effectively, if what you're saying is, well, if we violate the rights of 100,000 people, then we'll be able to bring about this massive benefit. That should cut no ice with the individual people who are rights holders, whose rights you would be infringing. So I take it that even if the project as a whole does have really compelling benefits, it will bring significant health benefits. So that doesn't provide a decent justification for violating someone's rights. So I think it's difficult to to make the case that somehow we're justified in infringing genuine moral rights in order to bring about public benefit. So a second alternative for trying to justify what it is that we're doing would be to say, well, maybe what we're doing is we're infringing someone's moral right in order to protect other kinds of rights. So I guess one way of kind of articulating, the kind of scenario in which this might happen is that I know, probably like me, whenever you go to the airport, it's going to have this very annoying thing where people demand that you take off your belt, then your shoes, and it's all slightly demeaning. You feel you've been pretty much cheapened by the whole thing. People are people take your water off you for no good reason, and all sorts of things happen that you didn't want to have. The sorts of things in usual circumstances you might feel would violate your rights, but you might well have a thought that, well, the right to security is so important, or the right, and the state's duty to protect people from harm is so important that despite the fact they're doing something which would usually be a violation of rights in a usual circumstance, because these sorts of actions are proportionate and they're necessary to protect other sorts of rights, then it's okay, no violation of rights occur. And so you might try to argue from the idea that, okay, well, protection of public health is really, really important. Protection of health is important. Health is a matter of rights as well. If we perform this research study, or we do this commissioning, or we do whatever this is we want to do with people's data, then that's necessary in order to fulfil our rights commitment as a government. So that I suspect that some of the uses, maybe I suspect not all of them, but some of the uses of data by the government may fall into that category. So it might be that, there's certain things that, I guess have begun to leak out and be talked about. For example, the use of NHS data to try and track down people who might be thought, accused of being terrorists. So if there was a genuine and proportionate reason for thinking that data could be useful for preventing crimes from occurring, then you might well take the view that, okay, well, that's definitely an infringement of the right of the person who's suspected of being a terrorist, but it might be proportionate to do that if there was very good grounds for thinking it. But the kind of cases that we have in mind, or that come to our committee, are very rarely of that sort. It's more like somebody's doing a research study, and what they want to say is, well, we think there's some kind of new study that we could do, which was is quite likely to have some beneficial effects if we're able to do that, and we can do this a bit more effectively if we have more data rather than less data. It's not the same sort of thing as saying, well, we need to do this or else terrorist acts will occur. And so that so whilst I think it's true that sometimes it's justifiable to infringe rights to protect other rights, it's difficult to get that case off the ground as a justification for something like Section 251. And so that leaves us with one other account, which I'm going to commend to you as a suggestion of how to solve this problem. And so my solution is actually going to start from the thought, well, in fact, yes, there is a genuine right here, and yes, we have to accept that the use of identifiable data for new purposes does infringe people's rights, and those people would have a right to veto that use if they wanted to. And a lot of this comes back to thinking about what rights are for, what sorts of things that they protect. So, because rights kind of protect freedoms or interests, they can often be a little bit overprotective. And one example would be, say, if you on a walk in the countryside, and you think, well, okay, well, either we're going to have to retrace our steps or we're going to have to cross over that farmer's fields. And imagine it's not like a public right-of-way or anything of that sort, but rather it's a kind of case where well, I know that the farmer owns that land, and he would be within his rights if he wanted to stop me crossing the land. But nonetheless, I think, well, he's unlikely to mind. I'm not harming him in any way. It's been much more convenient for me to cross the land. I think that's a kind of case where I would say I would describe that as a case of reasonable trespass, where you are trespassing on someone's property. They would be within their rights to throw you off if you wanted to, but nonetheless you thought about it and you think that your trespassing is proportional. And so I think there are a number of cases of this sort, so that, you know, say if I'm making a casserole and I know that there's a bay tree in someone's garden down the lane, and I can, from the pavement, I can stand on the pavement and sniff off a couple of leaves of their bay tree. You know, I think, again, well, there's a sense in which I'm violating that person's right if they wanted to, or if they had a sign up, that made it clear that nobody may take my bay leaves under any circumstances, then I think I probably would have wronged them by doing that. They'd have made it clear that they didn't want people to do that. But as it is that I'm infringing their right in a minor way, in a way that I think it's probably reasonable to think that they wouldn't object to. And so what this points out to is that, that in some ways rights end up being a bit overprotective. So if you like, there's a kind of, they allow people to be mean-spirited in a certain way. So the person could be within their right to say, well, nobody can pick one of my bay leaves even if they need it for their casserole, or nobody can cross my field even if it doesn't harm them. I think that's describes the case with health information as well. So I think that there may well be cases where we think, well, people would be within their rights to object to something and stop their information being used in a certain way, despite the fact that there would be no cost to the individual whose information is used in that way. It would be mean-spirited of them not to agree to it, but because they're right holders, they're perfectly within their right to be mean-spirited in the defence of their rights, if they want to. So I think that allowing for mean-spiritedness is kind of important. It's not, as it were, we don't think that rights are a good thing because we think that people being mean-spirited is a good thing, but rather you can't defend rights without allowing people to be mean-spirited in defending their rights. So I think there are all sorts of cases where we think that, you know, behaving kind of slightly mean-spiritedly in this way is, well, at least morally criticisable. We might not go so far as to say it's actually, you know, deliberately morally wrong, but that there's one of my, you know, favourite political philosophers, Grotius, wrote a treatise in the 17th century about the law of the sea. Basically, he's trying to make the case that nobody should be able to own the sea, just because, you know, he thought it was absurd that, given the sheer size of the sea, that different countries should try to claim ownership of the sea, when all sorts of anybody can move through the sea without impeding one another. And he drew an analogy to fire, which I kind of quite like. I'll read it out for you. You know, if any person should prevent any other person from taking fire from his fire, or light from his torch, I would accuse him of violating the law of human society, because that is the essence of its very nature then. Why then, when it can be done without any prejudice to his interest, will not one person share with another things which are useful to the recipient and no loss to the giver? And so Grotius's point is that maybe people have a right, you know, to hoard their fire and not give it to somebody who needs to light their own torch. But there's definitely something morally criticisable about that. So that to believe in rights, it's not necessary to say that we think that whenever somebody does something in defence of their rights, or something that's allowed by their rights, they automatically do the right thing or a good thing. So that the philosopher Jeremy Waldron once described that as rights to do wrong, as he thought that, well, if you believe in rights, you have to accept the fact that, you know, along with the idea of rights comes the idea of, you know, you have a right to do things that are wrong. Nobody can prevent you from doing things that are morally wrong. That's part of what he thought came with the idea of the right. So where this takes us, I think, is that we have to accept that individuals have a right to object, a right that their identifiable information not be used in this way if they don't want it to. But that there'll be lots of cases where it's reasonable to suppose that somebody won't want to object. And so I think this is part of why it's really important to do the sort of work that the Wellcome Trust are doing at the moment in their project on understanding patient attitudes to health data. Because it seems that it's really an empirical question, the sorts of circumstances under which, you know, different groups of people will object to their health information, identifiable information being used in certain ways. It's going to require public engagement. And given that we know that it's basically up to individuals who are the right holders, they can object if they want to. We can't sort of solve that problem a priori as philosophers. We can put in place the kind of framework that I put here, but it's really up to individuals to decide what they want to object to and what they don't. So before we've got sort of the full results from Wellcome and also taking into account some of the empirical work that's already been done, I think that if we take as a rule of thumb the following three suggestions, that first of all, the purpose has got to be a good one. It's got to be something like in the public interest. And that's turned out to be particularly important when you're talking about commercial uses of health data. It turns out that from the work that the Wellcome Trust have done, that the thing that's the real red light for people is if it's commercial and they can't see in what way it's in the public interest, and they just want to say, well, no, that's a red line for me. I just don't want to do that at all. So the purpose has to be good. You have to be able to show there's some kind of public interest or public benefit. I think also for it to be reasonable to as it were, for it to be a case of reasonable trespass, you have to be able to show that the risk to the individual whose right is being trespassed on is minimal. So this leaves us with a kind of model which, interestingly, turns out to be pretty similar to the one that we actually have with the Confidentiality Advisory Group and Section 251. So the model would be that it's reasonable to proceed without consent where it's permissible to proceed without consent, where it's reasonable to think that the vast majority of those whose data you're using in this way would not object, and that where use without consent occurs, this must be done in the light of the fact that the individual is still a rights holder, so that it needs to be reasonably possible for the individual to discover how their data is being used and to object if they want to. And if somebody does want to opt out, they need to be able to do so without difficulty. So we started from the thought that, well, if we take privacy seriously as a moral right, then this does seem to create quite a big prima facie worry for something like Section 251. It seems to be difficult on the face of it to justify how it can be morally permitted to use people's identifiable information without their consent, if we acknowledge that those people do have a genuine and important moral right to privacy. But I've provided you with an account which I think allows us to explain how, in certain constrained circumstances, it is legitimate to use people's health information without their identifiable health information without their permission, even if you are a strong believer in rights. And so that doing so, I think, partly coincidentally, I didn't set out to think, well, I'm trying to provide an ethical justification for Section 251, but I sort of thought it through almost with a blank page, and it turned out that the model I came up with was actually fairly similar to what we actually have in the NHS. And so that it looks like my conclusion is that as well as there being a legal gateway for this, I think it is ethically justified to proceed in this way, even if you believe that patients do have real and robust privacy rights. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yeah, I realised I should have said something at the very beginning of the talk, which was that although I was mentioning things that I may be doing as a committee, I'm not in any way speaking on behalf of NHS Digital or any other body. I'm speaking only in my own capacity today. Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, in terms of a possible criticism of the sort of state of affairs, the idea of sort of uncertainty, that yes, you might sort of forget any given study say actually, the risk of someone sort of being harmed is probably quite low, but obviously you don't actually know what it is because you don't know the personal sort of context of each individual and what the information, what the effect of the information could have on their lives. And sort of, I don't know, sort of to what extent can you say actually we can't say for certain, and perhaps the purpose of having rights sort of written into law in this context is to kind of prevent absolutely any sort of risks to the individual. And secondly, perhaps to expand on a little bit more, is to say otherwise, if you sort of allow something like this, could you maybe sort of perverted in such a way to justify anything by feigning ignorance as to, in some of you say, oh, well, I didn't consider, the risks, so that's fine because, so yeah, in terms of justifying sort of more sort of, I guess, harmful sharing of information.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have a bash at both of those, and if I haven't quite got hold of what you wanted to ask, then do come back. So on the first one about sort of absolutism and rights, I think that there may be different sorts of rights here. So something like, say, right against torture, you might well want to be an absolutist about. You might want to say, well, there might be no circumstances in which you think it's legitimate to torture somebody, even if big benefits will come about. I think there may be reasons for thinking that that privacy isn't that kind of a right. First of all, that it seems that there are all sorts of ways in which we reveal ourselves to one another on a day-to-day basis, and it's difficult to avoid that. So that's just most people are not very good at sort of masking their body language, for example. Or you walk down the street, people can see you. If people can tell whether you're bald or whether you're pregnant. There are all sorts of things about us which, in some kind of context, we might want to keep secret, but which are, in fact, often very difficult to hide from one another. And so there's kind of almost sort of in principle limits on how much control that we can have over the sort of information that other people know about one another. And the idea that there are trade-offs, there is I guess it's baked into a lot of the way that people already operate in the world. So that the number of people who seem to be very willing, for example, to join Facebook, say, and sort of end up sort of revealing things about themselves either to other people who are sort of friends of friends or indeed to those sort of doing the big data mining. So it seems that maybe there are some people who do think of privacy is like an absolute right, as a thought that it could never be okay to violate someone's privacy, almost in the same way as it could never be right to torture somebody. But it's a difficult position to maintain, both because of the empirical circumstances of human life and also just given the way that most people tend to regard their own privacy. So that would be the answer to the first question. And the second question seems to be more about, well, if we take my model here, could we easily abuse it? Effectively, could we say, well, we thought about it and we decided it was reasonable to trespass, and that's enough? Now, I do see that as a genuine worry, and I think so. You can't just be down to an individual to decide, one individual to decide. Well, maybe the example of the farmer's field was a bit misleading in that way. So that, so I think if it really was a matter of the researchers sitting down and thinking, well, I think it's reasonable to use people's data in that way, that you can see that there's often a conflict of interest on the part of the researcher, and you can see that it'd be very easy for people to overstep the mark in that way. So I think it would be useful to have something similar to what you have with the confidentiality advisory group, to have a group of independent individuals who can debate it and think through, okay, well, is this genuinely in the public interest to do this? Is it proportionate to do that? So I would accept that as a worry, and it's something that would need to be worked through in process.
Thank you. Sorry, could I just clarify sort of one more thing? Perhaps as an example, sort of the bay leaf example seems sort of intuitively obvious that it should be fine. But sort of my worry is perhaps that in one possible universe, that bay leaf might belong to a plant that was imported from, I don't know, some place in Africa and cost £1,000 per leaf, and you just kind of devaluated the whole plant. I mean, obviously, it's unlikely that would be the case, but there's a possibility. And sort of in comparison to the torture case, you kind of know, okay, these are if I do torture this person, benefits, drawbacks. If I don't, benefits, drawbacks. And you can make somewhat of a sort of assessment in the moment. But whereas, you don't know the person, you don't have any interaction with the person, so or whatever individual, so you don't know you don't know how to calculate, I suppose, the risks. I suppose instead of just saying like, actually, I think this is probably okay because it's okay for me, because you don't know the.
No, I would agree with that as a worry. I think that maybe the first thing there is to say, well, that's maybe one of the reasons why it's important to allow people the ability to opt out. Not merely as it were to say, oh, I'm cutting across the field or do the equivalent, but as it were to give people the opportunity to object if they want to. And where somebody has a very specific reason for wanting to object in that way, then they're much more likely to be able to pick that up as a worry, I suspect, if you provide them with adequate information. So that'd be one point. The other point is, I think that even with the best will in the world, if you're as rigorous as you can be to try to give people the right information or to proceed in a way which you think would be a reasonable trespass on someone's rights, you are going to get it wrong. Sometimes you will have ended up treating people in the way that, in fact, they wouldn't have consented to. And I think at that point, well, you can remove their data or you can apologise. But I think that I think it's some kind of defence at that point to say, well, as it were, we took these steps and we thought it was reasonable to proceed in this way, and we're sorry if you feel wronged. I think it can, because the alternative to that is it seems it's always going to be difficult to reach some individuals, and if you've got a cohort of 100,000 people, if the alternative is to say, well, you can't do it at all because there might be somebody who might have a really vociferous objection to it, you don't know who they are yet, and they might not exist. That would sort of seem to stymie things, and also maybe that comes back to how important privacy is. You might think it's really quite important that people have enough privacy, but whether privacy is so important that you couldn't risk violating some individual's privacy in some particular aspect. I suspect most people don't think that privacy is quite that important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks. I have two related questions, I would say, about the way you suggested the right to privacy on the one hand, and the use of secondary data in Interact. So it's important. You framed it, and I think it's important, as a problem about the use of secondary data.
Yeah.
So this is data we obtained, presumably after we asked for consent from patients. Now, one reason this is so this suggests that there are two kinds of worries about the now reuse of this kind of data. One is the privacy concern that you raised. A second is that certain things that we might do, even if there's no right to privacy, I think that counter to some of the things you said, there may still be a problem of the use of the information if our use somehow undermines invalidates the consent given in the past, 15 years ago. So if the consent was obtained under the understanding that the data would not be used for certain purposes, and then I use them for these kinds of purposes, then I think there might be a claim to be made that this undermines, invalidates the previous consent that was given. So that's one kind of worry. The second kind of worry is that...
Do you mind if I answer the first worry first?
Okay.
Or at least then just so I wanted to sort of have it get on. So yeah, I think I would probably agree with you about the first worry. Or it's the kind of one case. It may not be that most of the other people in the audience got it, but just to give a case that maybe makes it a bit more vivid. I can imagine maybe 10 years ago you tell me your grandmother's recipe for sort of salt beef or Christmas pudding, and then say, well, you can use it for these sorts of things, but don't ever publish it. And then 10 years later, I then publish it. Yeah, I think, I've wronged you in a certain way, but probably the wrong isn't to do with privacy. It's about sort of how I entrusted the information with, so that yes, that might be so that maybe your thought is that maybe that's the most basic kind of wrong here, that it's all about consent, and privacy is a bit of a red herring. Yeah.
So no. So
okay.
So I think this is certainly a worry to be thought of in this context and so this is one worry. So in some cases you seem to suggest that if there's no right to privacy, then there's nothing too much to worry about. So we agree that is not accurate. So
okay.
Now the second worry I have is this. So suppose you obtained consent at the time, but you want to say that there is a right to privacy,
Yeah.
which impacts what we could presumably do with data without consent. Okay, so it seems to me that then there should be a very simple test that you should consider in this case. So if I've given my consent to one thing, and certainly not to the use of this data, but I have a right, a privacy right here, then the question should be, or one possible test to be employed here is, can we run this this kind of study without obtaining consent at all? I mean, don't frame it as a question of secondary use of data. How about collecting this data without any kind of consent? Because it seems to me that in as much as consent is relevant to here, this is practically what you're doing. I mean, I have two rights. I have a right to the use ownership right over my car, and I have my lawn, which I have a right that you not trespass on. Basically, in such a case, if you obtain my permission to use my car, this doesn't permit you to then run over my lawn with my car without obtaining consent. It seems to me that this is the kind of situation I permitted you, gave you my permission to do one thing. Now you want to do something completely different against which you're doing, I have a right. So the fact that I once gave you some kind of permission to something else seems to me completely irrelevant. The question now is whether I can violate this or do this thing that you suggest to do without asking for your consent. In which case, I think the test should be, can we do this kind of study without obtaining informed consent from the participants? It seems to me that once you put it like this, I think it would be very difficult to justify many of the studies you want, given the kind of requirements that are generally accepted on experiments on human beings without consent.
Well, I want to say two things in response to that. The first one is that I think we may not be quite as far apart as you imagine, because I think that the core of the right to privacy is a right to control information about yourself, and so that to that extent, kind of consent is at the heart of it, because insofar as you consent to certain uses of information, you've waived part of your right. So the use of the information that way is no longer wrongs you. That'd be one thought, and so that I didn't address it in the talk explicitly. We started from the thought of consent given for one purpose, and you want to use it for another purpose. But an implication of the view that I'm defending at the end is, well, yes, it would be legitimate to do this in cases where there was no initial consent to start off with at all. And I think I'm less worried about that than maybe you think I should be. That if it's a case where, even if no initial consent has been given, but it's one of those cases where we think that there could be significant benefits from infringing the rights, the risk is minimal. We think that we're pretty sure that a very small percentage of people would actually, in fact, object to this. Then, I think I'd be happy to go ahead on that basis. And if it turned out that some people wanted to object, then yes, allow them to opt out. And I think so long as you can show that you've made a reasonable efforts, whatever reasonable efforts mean in this context, that's something to be specified. As long as you can show you've made reasonable efforts to contact that individual and to give them the ability to opt out, and then I think that it's possible to do that without violating their rights.
Yes, I just wanted to give, as an example of how a definition can change over time, organ transplantation. Years ago, we were all encouraged to sign organ donor cards, which I was led to believe meant that organs would be taken after our death. And I agreed with that. Now, years later, I discovered that organs have to be taken from a patient with a beating heart. Otherwise, the organs are largely useless. Now, this completely changes what we were led to believe, and it means that something I agreed to years ago, I no longer agree to.
Yeah, I think that's a useful case. I mean, one of the complexities there is that almost the understanding of what death is has changed. So that, I mean, I think it's not completely unreasonable to think that somebody's died, well, that somebody could have died if, despite the fact that their heart is still beating. A lot of it depends on what you think is the essence of the human. So that if somebody's sort of completely lost all consciousness, irreparably, that part of their brain is gone forever, and literally where their chest is still going up and down, and their flesh is pink, but that everything else is gone, then, well, at that point it's a bit of a philosophical conundrum, because at one level the animal is still alive, but as it were, the person is dead. And you could well, it's not unreasonable to take the view that what matters about a person is dead and is gone forever. And so that, yeah, I think probably in that kind of circumstance, I myself would judge that I had died. It may be that you have a different view, and you think that, as it were, it all comes down to whether your heart is still beating. I think it comes down to kind of brain and consciousness myself.
Can I briefly respond?
Yeah, of
I
course.
agree with you, but the exception is that there have been cases of pregnant women who've been in things like car crashes who end up brain dead or in PVS, but still deliver a healthy baby. Now, in no way could we say that that pregnant woman was dead. She's very much alive, even though she might be brain dead or in a vegetative state.
I think possibly it's dangerous kind of getting sidetracked on this, but one thing I could argue is that given that it's certainly conceptually possible to gestate a human being in almost like a mechanical womb or in a laboratory, you don't know how to do it, but that were we able to do that, I don't think that would lead us to say that whatever the gestating machine must be alive because it delivered a live human baby. So I think that I can see the pull of what you're saying, but I don't think it necessitates us to say that the woman was still alive. I think I can imagine if you were a strong proponent of an idea of kind of brainstem death or cortical death, that you could still want to hold on to the idea that person really had died at the point when the baby was delivered.
Well, I think it's just that our view of death has changed.
Yeah.
Definitions of death have changed.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So I was partly playing devil's advocate, but I think you have a strong point.
I think I've got two questions, and they're not related, but you're pretty good at relating things, so they might be. Quite early on in your talk, you said, well, sort of paraphrase, it's okay if the data can be suitably anonymised, you can then use it. Is that reasonable? Because I think the underlying assumption in there is that you're saying that so no one can find out that I've got a particularly horrible disease, which is a different justification from saying I own that information and you can't use it. I don't, it's not a matter of whether people find out what I've got. I just own it. You can't use it. Like you can't use my car, even if you can get it to start and take someone who's died to hospital. It's a matter of ownership rights rather than the revealing right. That's the first question, and whether that then, if the justification is entirely based on whether other people can find out what strange diseases I've got, that if there's 100,000 people in a study and there's no practical way of identifying me in it, that would be different from if there were 20 people in the study where you might be able to identify me because of other characteristics that you see in the data. In other words, a very large group. So that's one question. The second question is, my understanding is that there are generic Section 251 agreements which allow the health service and indeed others to organise themselves. They can use the data to sort out their prioritisation and their planning of services. Some of that is based on 251 agreements. And the justification there is a comment rather than a question. Justification there would, I suppose, need to be that everybody, or people in society expect that, quote, taxpayers' money will be used effectively to run the best sort of health service. We might disagree what the best sort of health service is, but we can at least agree that it's better to be more efficient than less efficient in some sense. And it's not, I mean, we do have a right to say that our taxpayers' money should be used appropriately, but I think just focusing on research studies gives it a sort of emotional dimension where you say, yeah, it's really good to be able to use the data to find a cure for cancer.
Yeah.
People get less worked up if you're using the data to run the health service more efficiently than it otherwise would be run. And so the justification for those sorts of agreements to be able to use people's data because there's so many of them you couldn't get consent would be rather different.
Yeah. I would agree on the second one, and I think that's maybe part of why there's been quite a lot of pushback. I thought, well, sort of, why is it that you think you need identifiable information to do this sort of thing like sort of commissioning? And a lot of the time it seems to have turned out when people have been pushed on that, in fact, they could make do with either a lot less identifiable information or without identifiable information altogether for these processes like commissioning and so on. So I think I would agree with you there. So it's part of why I wasn't quite sure how to place it, but towards the end I was trying to say the sorts of circumstances in which it would make this kind of trespassing on people's rights reasonable. I wanted to talk about whether it's about kind of public interest or the importance of the end to be achieved or something of that sort. So that I think you're right that where people think that the use of their data is plausibly connected to a cure for cancer, or at least sort of pushing on some kind of research, that I think they may be much more likely to allow that than if it's something where it's something where they don't really see the point of it, or where it's to do with kind of some kind of measure about health service utilisation or something of that, which doesn't really mean anything to them. So yeah, I would completely accept that point. And the first question I thought was it was quite deep, and I might need to ask a bit more help from you on how to answer it. And so that I think that there's quite an important point there, and I haven't really worked out what the right answer to it is. So that there's quite a lot of work that people get excited on from a sort of cryptographic perspective on the idea of differential privacy. So that they use a set of basic algorithms so you can show that, well, if you take any one individual's data out of how things presented, then it will make no difference to the results. And so that using a set of I guess techniques which make the data very slightly vaguer, you can do that. And so that you can say to any one individual, well, we haven't violated your right to privacy because the result would still be exactly the same if precisely your data wasn't included in the set. That's the kind of argument that people like Cynthia Dwork and others try to use as a way of saying, well, this is a solution to this kind of problem. Whereas I think there is a much more basic challenge where somebody might want to say, well, if it's my data, then I should be able to decide that it's not being used in order to create this sort of big statistical artifact in the first place. And yeah, so I think that's a challenge, and I didn't really address it in this paper. To be honest, I'm not really quite sure how to address it. So that within the way that NHS Digital processes data, it just kind of assumed that once things are inside the boundaries of NHS Digital, you can use identifiable information for what you like. And it's only once it goes outside of NHS Digital that there's a problem. Whereas it's not entirely clear to me that that's the right solution, but I don't know what the right solution to it would be. And certainly, it does look to me that if I was to think through entirely consistently and at depth some of the thoughts I was expressing about privacy as a right or as a control, that it looked like it might lead you to want to say, well, I ought to be able to control what's going on even inside the bits of NHS Digital where they're doing this process before it gets spat out to the outside world. So yes, it's something that worries me, but I don't have a good answer to it. Yeah.
I think in the context of research, I would agree that, in the context of research, I would agree that consent, unless it is the case of clinical trials where informed consent is obligatory, generally in research studies, I don't think that consent is the most appropriate, because even if you received the right permissions and you continue to do the same thing for years, I believe that after a while it becomes unreasonable trespass, because you cannot really say that you received consent 10, 15 years ago and this is still valid. It doesn't matter if you do something new or the same thing. I think I would agree with the reasonable trespass model, because this is recognized in the law anyway, because consent is not the only legal base to process health data. There is legitimate interest, public interest, statutory functions, etc., etc. I also agree with the idea of law and morality, because especially in the continent, in the US, moral values are very much part of the legal system. But even with England, it's a little bit different, because the privacy laws were very robust at the beginning of the 20th century, and then everything stopped. So it didn't develop as a legal or as a moral value of privacy. But even within laws like the Data Protection Act, I think there are moral values, for instance, the autonomy of the individual and the power of the individual to make the decision. So with regard to the reasonable trespass, I think it should be made very clear that the individual should ultimately decide what is detrimental or not to them. And that comes through information, not necessarily through the use of consent. And this is also the direction of travel. The new developments in law and ethics in data protection, they really focus on the autonomy and the empowerment of the individual. So my question is that although the reasonable trespass model is the right one, in my opinion only, who makes a decision? Because the decision moves away from the passive, from the organizations and the law which protects the powerless data subject, and moves towards the prosumer who really decides how his or her data will be used. So for me, the challenge is who decides the reasonable trespass, the organization which processes the data or the individual. This is the challenge for the future, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good and a deep challenge. I think that some of the worries around that is that I guess we're aware that people have sort of limited attention span, and if you have sort of if we think that that the right to privacy, the right to control information about yourself is kind of goes broad and deep, then is the question, well, should you be getting kind of emails or rung up all the time about, okay, we want to trespass in this way, do you consent to it? You can imagine it would drive people nuts in the way that it does when people continually have to consent to things on their computer, and they, sort of a 30-page contract that they just have to click yes to before they're able to use the software. So that I think there's a real challenge in how to layer that information, and I think that there has to remain a really significant role for groups whose role it is to judge whether something is broadly in the public interest, whether it's the sort of thing that sort of meets the broad category of a reasonable trespass. So otherwise, if you lump everything onto the individuals who we think of as the right holders, then it's going to be quite onerous to them. And I think that people are going to decide that isn't what they wanted in the first place. So I think that you probably need to have a sort of two-stage model in which principles are set down about the sorts of things that are sort of could be acceptable as reasonable trespasses, and then still when something's past that, then people have the ability to opt out if they want to.
I've got a comment and a question. Each of them's more to do with the sort of responses that have happened since, really. So first of all, a comment really about the matter of consent raised earlier. I think really just to remember that because we're talking about health data that's been collected as part of in general terms, that's often been collected as part of the giving and receiving of health care. Yeah. Not to forget that it's not a case that there's no consent, actually, because in fact there's what's often termed implied consent, because that information was given to, for example, the doctor or the clerk or the nurse or so on, as part of the care that person was receiving. So, clinical symptoms and personal details like name and address and even date of birth and so on. So all that personal information was given in a model of consent. So it's not that there's no consent. And so therefore that's where I think that the term secondary uses comes from, because the original use was in fact the healthcare. As a clinician, I always tend to think of that as the first use, and then the new use comes thereafter. So I just wanted to mention about the matter of implied consent. But really, I suppose a question, something that I've never really felt that comfortable about, is really to do with the matter of sort of ownership of data and ownership of anonymised data. So I think there probably is a classic example, but I can't remember what it is. But let's just say, so somebody has a religious or conscientious objection to use of the data in a research in a controversial area. I mean, abortion, perhaps, for example, and it seems to me that if their data is used in an anonymised form, that somehow it no longer becomes their data. They don't have a right or an ownership to that data, so they don't have a say because the data is anonymised. And yet you could argue that the trespass, the moral trespass, is greater. But in fact, in law, there's nothing that person can do. They can't opt out of that because it's anonymised. And so the argument is that it doesn't do them any harm. But actually, it seems to me in that sort of example that there is a trespass, but legally there's no recourse.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting case. So it may be just a case where our best account of the ethics comes apart from the law in that kind of scenario, so that yes, it looks well. Certainly, or there may be points where you think that somebody should be able to make a decision. If the data is being held as identifiable, and somebody wants to de-identify it in order to use it for a study that person objects to, then it might be that as it were, the point where you could object to it would be at the point at which somebody wants to de-identify it for the purposes of the study. I mean. So there might be a decision point you could put in. That's one thought. Second thought would be about, I guess, the nature of ownership of data and other things. So that, I mean, I think there's one sense in which it's quite intuitive for the person who has that strong religious or other kind of objection to say, well, as it were, it's still my data. And if you like, as it were, there's a literal sense it might literally be those were the numbers which were collected by that person's GP about that person. So that, I mean, despite the fact you might not be able to trace the information back to that person, there's a clear sense in one sense it's that person's data. It's certainly data about that kind of person. And I think maybe in order to make some progress on that, I think we need to come back to questions about why do you think that privacy is valuable? How strong a right to privacy do you want? How wide-ranging should it be? And so that there are different kinds of strands within philosophical work on the right to privacy. Some people want to defend privacy as an intrinsic right, as if to say, well, privacy is just as important a right as the right to life or the right to autonomy. So other people effectively say, well, privacy is a kind of a right, but it's a right which largely exists for instrumental reasons. It's because we value other things about living our lives in certain ways that we need to accord people a certain amount of privacy. And so that those sorts of things will factor into to the degree of control where you think it's sensible to allow people over information about them once it's no longer attachable to that person. And if you're somebody who has a really strong intrinsic idea of the importance of privacy, then you might want to say, well, just, even if it has been anonymised, it's still that person's data in some recognisable sense. I mean, I think that approach is, well, it's kind of problematic for various reasons, but I don't have a knockdown argument against it. I think it overvalues privacy, or it overvalues the way in which privacy is valuable. And on implied consent, I would completely agree with you. I was sort of wrestling this morning about whether to. I tweaked the title. It was originally called secondary use, and I called it to new uses, because I'm thinking that secondary uses is one kind of case where you collect the data for purposes of direct care, and then you want to use it for purposes beyond that. But I think it struck me that exactly the same problem arises in the research context when you had it for one research context and you want to use it for a very different research context. So I sort of wanted to say that it's not just about what's often described as secondary uses in that way, but yeah, I completely take that point.
I mainly had a question because I heard you also work for Digital NHS.
I sit on a committee which they convene, let's say.
Okay, because I came in a little bit later. In what way is digital data now different from the way we used to have it when it was written down in books and stocked in dossiers? Because I don't see why or if there is a difference now.
Okay, that's a great question, but I think that the biggest differences are just what you can do with the data. So we just have a much greater volume of data. We can move it around a lot more quickly than we ever used to. So that if you have data which is hand-coded, which has been written by doctors or nurses on charts and then it's filed away, then it's a massive effort for somebody to go through that, collate it, and to find things out. Whereas if it's all coded on computers, then you can run the same. What might have taken months to do if you'd had to look manually through lots of charts can be done in an afternoon. You could pull the data off, and because you can generate that much amount of data much more quickly, you have much more data available, and you have different data sets which you can link together. To do that used to be incredibly difficult to do. If it's all in paper records, then you can do it. You can set up tables. You can do that, but it's years and years of work to do it. Whereas if it's all computerized in the first place, then you can. It gives you much greater flexibility. There's just a much greater variety of research questions you can ask, and also because the data is much more integrated, it creates a much greater possibility for things like violations of privacy. So, if you have records in an individual GP's office, then somebody might be able to break into them, and then steal some records. But the records will be heavy, and there's a limited amount they can get away with. But if you have a situation in which there's large databases can be put onto computers and then or onto memory sticks, and then people can leave them on trains, then millions of people's private medical records can be blown open just by some sort of idiot who's had some drinks at the Christmas party. Yeah.
Well, I do understand that, but as far as I thought for digital data, so we can anonymize it, and therefore you can have really large data sets with lots of people, which is all anonymized, and the link is somewhere else. So it's in a way it's much harder to link data to the individual. Whereas if you would steal a dossier, you would have the names on each page of the patient with the data, and it's all together.
Yeah. I want to say yes and no to that, but a lot of it will depend on questions of contract and kind of training and duties, because even the stuff which is has all the obvious identifiers stripped out, you can if somebody's malicious, then it's quite easy to identify somebody. If you know a fact about someone, say if you know that Tony Blair had a heart operation on a particular day, and you have the whole hospital episode statistics, and you know that, then you can find, if you can trace through that particular, you look for patients who had a heart operation on a particular day, then don't know how many of them are, but then you could find out one or two other contextual facts. You might well be able to narrow it down to Tony Blair or find any one individual that you want to without too much difficulty. But I mean, it wouldn't be legal to do that, and the data is only provided in such a way as to deliberately to make it very hard for that to happen. So that the contract will ensure that if somebody tries to do that, they'll lose their job and various other sorts of things. But it's a lot of those factors alongside the data sets which make the difference about how easy it is to identify people. As a matter of sheer computation, it's actually quite easy. There's a famous case back in the 80s in the States. I've forgotten which US state it was, where the governor at that time said, well, what's great, they had a state medical system, and they said, well, we'll make all this data available to researchers and to companies, and no problems with this at all. And this was back in the 80s when the computational power was nothing compared to what it was now. And Latanya Sweeney, who was only now a very famous privacy researcher, then only just a graduate student, basically said, well, she was able to find the governor's medical records in about a few hours by the fact that they thought they stripped out the identifiers, but they basically they still left in date of birth and kind of zip code, and it turned out that there's only about 2 people in the same zip code with the same date of birth as the governor, and there's some other piece of information they were able to get, and so she decrypted his medical records. She delivered them to him within 2 days after, a couple of days after he made the thing about how everything's safe, and he then felt a bit foolish. So, I mean, that was what we were able to do 20 or more years ago. The sheer sort of level of computational power is, 1,000 times what it used to be then. So yeah, it's a very real risk, and so that it's certainly possible to make things much more difficult to identify, but there's no magic bullet, and that certainly if you look at the mathematics of privacy, then, as it were, any information you put out, even if it's aggregate information, it makes it slightly easier to identify people. The question is, how much risk are we willing to allow?
And also the practicalities,
Yeah.
because people need to do research.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
The health system is where
Yeah, I've got time for one more question. Basically, I've got to get a train to Llandudno from Euston at 7:10, so I'm going to have to leave very soon. But I shall answer.
Hopefully a short one. And it's actually slightly related to the last question. It's about public perception of how safe this data is, and how it's being stored, and how it's being used, and who has access to it, and whether that has any bearing on the rights or the case for whether it can be reused.
Yeah. So I think definitely at a practical level it does, because often sort of within science and technology studies, people talk about the license to operate. So and the thought is that, well, a lot of what happens in the NHS and elsewhere is dependent on the fact that people don't object to it too much. And what happened in cases like Care.Data is that, well, it turned out that you completely lost the license to operate. It got to the point where you wanted to set up a new system, it would require that the GPs to buy into it, and the GPs basically said, well, no, we don't think the safeguards are sufficient. At that point, it looked like, it turns out that it's completely unfeasible to run the system anymore, and they have to declare a pause, and the pause went on for a very long time until they kind of admitted about 3 years later, well, we're not really we've kind of abandoned the policy, and they kind of did that, kind of whispered it on a very quiet on a sort of news day when they hoped people wouldn't notice. So that I think it definitely makes a very significant practical difference. I think at an ethical level, maybe it makes a difference as well, because if you so there's this whole sort of reasonable trespass account. It depends on whether, given what you know about different sort of members of the public, what sorts of things are people likely to object to. And if you have evidence that people are likely to object to, for instance, to commercial uses of their data, and you go ahead anyway, then not only is it likely to blow up in your face, but if what I've said here is right, it might well be a violation of people's rights. And so that the reasonable trespass account, it only provides an ethical justification if you do it in good faith. If you know it's likely that people would object and you go ahead anyway, then it's just a violation of people's rights. It's not a reasonable infringement of them. Thank you.
Thank all of you for coming. Let's thank our speaker once again.
Thank you for the excellent question.